So we have 6 speakers, and Bob Vogel will keep us on track with our about approximately 10 minutes each. Our first speaker tonight is Gray Scrimgeour. And I don't think Gray would mind me saying that he is one of our senior ambassadors in Canadian philately. Many of you will remember him from his days in Toronto when he haunted the Toronto philatelic scene, probably bought out most of Steinhardt's Western Canadian stock. Gray retired from a professorship at University of Toronto, moved to Victoria, 1984, I think. Has been very prolific subsequently in his philatelic writing. He has too many publications to mention, but he has written a lot about Alan Steinhardt. He has written a postal history, the history of the Toronto Stamp Club. And he's a strong collector of not only Western Canada, but also Trans-Pacific Steamship Mail, U.S. Columbian issues, the Chicago World's Fair, 20th Century meter cancels, and too many other things to mention at the time. So, Gray, take it away.
Thanks, David. I've unmuted myself. I hope that's working. Yeah, I'm an old man. I'm 88 now, and we moved out here in the early 90s to Victoria. I believe I'm one of the oldest members of the PSSC, and I think only Kimball Solonen's a member and longer standing than I am. But it's nice to have the Zoom because I am not getting back to Toronto. I would like to talk this evening very briefly about foreign airmail route, U.S. for FAM2, which is an airmail route that was paid for by the United States to bring mail to and from Seattle, from Victoria, from the ships that were coming in across the Pacific and taking mail from the US to Victoria to be put on trans-Pacific ships. I got interested in this primarily because I was studying trans-Pacific steamship mail. And it's been an interesting airmail route to talk about. Chris Hargreave has written an excellent review article on it just a few years ago. It's a very different sort of air route. For example, it's airmail, but there is no airmail charge for the mail that's carried on it. What I'll be talking about tonight will just be the first flights, which occurred on October 15th, 1920. As I said, the route was planned to expedite mail to and from ships that were carrying mail across the Pacific. Here's a photograph of when the airplane from Seattle first arrived in Victoria. The pilot on the left is Eddie Hubbard. In the center is the Victoria postmaster, and on the right is the customs officer. The archives identify him as somebody else, but I have a photograph recently obtained by our railway history group identifying him as the man who was the customs officer. As you can see in the background, the Empress Hotel is there. So this plane landed right in the harbor. Recently, I was able to obtain a commercial first flight cover coming to Victoria from Seattle. And one of the important things to see is the little purple box just to the left of the stamp. It reads Seattle, Victoria Seaplane Mail. On the upper left, you can see Rush Please, aeroplane service. And the Seattle machine cancel October 15th. It arrived in Victoria about 3:30 p.m. and none of the incoming mail got back stamped. So I was very pleased to get a commercial cover because commercial covers carried by this airmail route are very scarce. It's easy to find 1925 souvenir covers, I would call them. They're available in the $10 to $15 range. Commercial ones, you're going to pay in 3 figures. Here is a philatelic first flight cover, mailed again in Seattle on October 15th. It's addressed to South Vancouver, BC, and in purple on the left-hand side of the envelope, you can see by first airplane, US to Canada. This is out of Jerry Welburn's collection. The cover was prepared by Albert C. Rossler. You can see his printing in the upper left, East Orange, New Jersey. He was a well-known stamp and cover dealer. He started about 1918 preparing and selling first flight covers. Again, no back stamp. Here is a return flight going back to Seattle from Victoria. And it's October 15th also, of course. And I can't make out the time. I think it's 3 p.m., but I'm not sure. It's addressed to E. Crocker, who was a stamp dealer in Victoria. The important thing to notice on here, you can see airplane service. A postmark over top of the stamp, and there's a small arrow there pointing to it. That postmark is seen only on covers mailed on October 15th. And there's a possibility that it was requested by Rossler, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Here is one of Rossler's many, well, probably a few dozen covers that were carried on the return trip to Seattle. And again, you can see in the upper right over the stamp, the airplane service. And he's put on the left, first trip, Canada to US, regular hydroplane mail service, October 15th. I've seen several of these covers. This is a facing slip from a parcel of postmarked covers that were sent from Victoria to A.C. Rossler back in New Jersey. It's dated October 15th in Victoria, a rather pale double circle in the center of the facing slip. It was received in East Orange on October 22nd, and it bears the airplane service mark in the lower left. Someone in the office staff in Victoria has written, "Kindly return this slip. Post office staff, Victoria, BC, Canada, for souvenir of first aerial mail." This came from a collection that was made by a former clerk in the Victoria Post Office. So it got saved right at the source, which was good. This note accompanied the facing slip. I'll read it. "Dear Sir," it's sent by A.C. Rossler. "As requested, I return the facing slip. I have asked the local post office to postmark it for your records. The mail, which left Victoria October 15th, and he says at 10 a.m., which is not correct, reached here October 21st. Thank you for special cancellation." So Rossler rubber stamped his signature, but he's thanking the people in the Victoria Post Office for the two-word hand stamp. And I wonder if he had requested it be made or if he had sent it, but it was only seen on the first day of the use of the FAM2 service. My conclusion out of this is really that we've seen some first day covers, which are very scarce, but also seen some insight into how Rossler bundled up covers and sent them to postmasters and asked them to forward them back to him. And in other words, how he got a lot of covers for his business. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, great.
You're welcome.
Extremely interesting. Our next speaker is Jim Taylor. Jim Taylor from Calgary. Jim has been a member of PSSC since 2008. He's a fellow of the Royal of Canada. He's a fellow of the Royal of London. He's one of our FIP accredited judges in Canada internationally. He collects a lot around St. Pierre Miquelon and various thematic topics. He's a regular author publishing both lengthy scholarly articles and shorter popular articles. And you may have seen some of his stuff in many of the journals you read. He's a former president of the Royal. He's written the St. Pierre Miquelon Specialized Catalog, which won a gold medal way back at Chicago PEX 2000. And you might remember now that the most recent Gary Lyon auction auctioned off a lot of Jim's St. Pierre and Miquelon material. He has 3 articles in our anthology, so I'm not sure exactly how he's going to schedule his time. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, the title of my article is "The 1931 Flight to St. Pierre Turns into an International Incident." Essentially, the economic downturn of the 1930s took hold in Canada, and one of the prized possessions, if you owned an airplane, was secure airmail contracts, and it was quite competitive. The organizers of the 1931 flight from Sydney, Nova Scotia to St. Pierre were J. Robert McCowan Jr., he was the owner-manager, H.W. Roy, the pilot, and George Cartier, the engineer. So they followed the pattern for semi-official airmail flights that was the standard practice in Canada during this period. And of course, carrying mail by air was the latest technological advancement, and new experimental airmail routes to isolated settlements were announced with great fanfare. Here's the map showing the route. And they got stopped by fog flying directly from Sydney to St. Pierre. And they had to stop off in the tiny settlement of Burgeo in southern Newfoundland. You can see by the map here. This is new research that I get involved with because there was a letter put through the post office here that used the cachets from the flight and were canceled in Burgeo, which I'll show. And then they, as the fog cleared, they headed off for St. Pierre. The return flight I'll talk about. It's again represented by a couple of covers, scarce covers, back to Sydney. Okay, this is the letter that was posted at Burgeo with the cachets from the flight that you see here on the prepared covers. They had about 4,000 covers from collectors across North America that paid a fee, which helped to defray the cost of the flight. And this was an unscheduled stop in Burgeo to wait for it while the fog cleared. So this is an example of the envelopes that were sent in with return addresses. You can see this one to Youngstown, Ohio. And they had their own cancellations made up. There's one sitting there. And this cachet that you see that was on the Burgeo cover. Now, in the back of the envelope, and this is one that's a bit exceptional, there was a message explaining why the mail was not received in St. Pierre and why it was not returned to collectors until many months later. This is the stamp that they prepared to go on the back, as was the custom in Canada at the time. And of course, it's canceled on here. And there's McGowan's autograph on the back. The covers that were returned, again, McGowan's autograph explained that even though they had made prior arrangements, and I have some of the letters that related to that, when they arrived in St. Pierre and they took the bag of 4,000 envelopes up to the post office up the hill from the dock where the plane landed, it got refused by the governor, even though they thought they'd made prior arrangements that they could get some St. Pierre stamps and pretty up the envelopes for the collectors. You can see what if you can read it here. It was many months before the collectors received the covers back, and that's the source of the covers that you see in the dealer boxes for the St. Pierre flight. Now, they do mentioning that the flight would continue from St. Pierre to St. John's, Newfoundland, but that leg of the flight was never flown. Okay, this is the aircraft here, CAHE, in the St. Pierre Harbor, and they got the floats on it, and it landed in the harbor, and you can see the local, some of the local fishermen put their boats out to greet, which would be an unusual sight in the harbor, an aircraft. It wasn't the very first flight of a plane in there, but it was probably the second. Now, the return flight, of course, was not planned. They wanted to go on to St. John's and use up some St. Pierre stamps and make a better looking cover for their customers. But there are only a couple of these postcards that were flown back, and you can see they're signed by Charles Roy, the pilot, souvenir of the first flight from St. Pierre back to Sydney, Nova Scotia. And you can see there's the CAHE plane, which I'll talk about a bit more as we go along. And this is the other side of the envelope. It's addressed to the pilot back at his address in Sydney. And, you know, they get a little bit philatelic with the whole thing. They did manage to post it locally and get a St. Pierre postmark. And then they've added a 5-cent Canadian airmail stamp that's been canceled on the 21st of August in Sydney, Nova Scotia. I've seen about 2 or 3 of these. They're not common, and usually you have to pay somewhere between $150 and $200 for one of these in auctions. Next. Okay, what happens is that the plane that was on the flight to St. Pierre changed hands many times over the years and ended up in this dilapidated condition, more or less being stored up in northern Alberta. What would happen is a lot of these vintage aircraft from early flights, when they became unserviceable, like we see this condition here, they were just left up in the bush. And there were various old aircraft hunters or museum people that went looking for these, and they found them. And nowadays, the remains of this aircraft are sitting in a museum at the old airport at Edmonton, and it's just in pieces. And it's described as, you know, what a wreck of an aircraft up in the Alberta bush would look like in the actual site. Okay, that's, I want to move on to the next one now. Let's try Air France. Here we go, the Air France non-postal labels. These are circa the 1940s and 1950s. And these are the design of 4 different aircraft that were on these labels, mainly as publicity for Air France. And, you know, here's one of their aircraft, the American-built Constellation, in flight over New York City. And there were 4 different designs. Okay, this is mainly how you see them collected in booklets that were handed out to high-paying passengers on their airline in probably little what they call goodie bags, I guess, nowadays, that included, probably shields for your eyes if you're trying to get some sleep on the different planes. So you can see this is the cover that's on 1, 2, the 4 types. And in French, it warns you against penalty of law not to attach the labels to the front of envelopes. So this is the large flying boat that they used to fly to Martinique from Paris and other European cities. This was a airliner that they used in France, and another type that was also used in the continent of Europe. And of course, the one we just showed there, which was the Constellation. Now, these had a peculiar arrangement when you have a full sheet, which are rather hard to come by for the whole set. So we can see here that these have a row of 2 upright dies, and you can see that they're upside down over here, which gives you, besides the booklet arrangement, which could be made for stamps in these 2 rows, or for that matter, when you turn it upside down for the booklets, it could be from these 2 rows. And you can also get an upside down and a right side up pair when you collect this row and this row together. So there's the interesting way to collect these. And again, they're a little scarcer than the single copies. And you can see the upright and the upside down in the 4 different designs. Of course, as soon as they say that by penalty of law that you should not use these on the front of flown envelopes, here's one that's nicely tied. These are hard to come by. Most of them end up, as we'll show a little later, stuck on the back of the envelopes, which was legal, but not as nice for the collector. And you can see the cachets. This particular flight was from Geneva to Martinique, Fort-de-France, by one of these airliners. They were giant airliners. At the time they were built, they were the largest aircraft in the world. And they were used in these they were actually transatlantic flights, but they never did go transatlantic to the United States or to Canada because they weren't equipped with de-icing or any of the things that you needed for colder weather. The other thing that happens is you find these things with overprints. And these are usually found on the back of envelopes, and they're probably hard to get as single stamps or print mint stamps. And they quote sort of experimental flights as overprints. So on this one, on a particular stamp that ended up in Bogota, Colombia. And here's one on the front, which again for another special flight, and another one for special flights. And I've researched these and actually come across with a sort of fourth overprint that is not listed in the special French catalog for these type of labels. So it's been an interesting search for the unusual. Again, this is the one that is not recorded in the French catalog, which is also found online, that features all the different labels that were issued in France, including the airmail ones from Air France. Again, nice to find one tied to the front of the envelope illegally, so to speak. Okay, that's it. And we're now moved to number 3 here, which is the Laticour 631 Hydro Avion. Laticour, founded his aircraft company in 1919, and he pretty well exclusively constructed hydro avion, or in English, seaplanes. Unfortunately, the seaplane was being developed in France in order to compete on the North Atlantic with the British and the Americans. Unfortunately, the French were at a disadvantage, mainly because they got invaded by the Germans while the aircraft, and here's a picture of it, was under construction. And the Germans went and seized it, and they repainted it with the swastika and the Iron Cross on it, and they went and papered over all the windows, and we're going to turn it into a patrol plane, a coastal patrol plane, and they went and parked it in a lake just north of Switzerland, and the British went and bombed it. So this one got sunk, if you want, while the Germans were trying to figure out what to do with it. In the meantime, the French had edition number 2 being prepared in the Latécourt factory in Toulouse. And what they did there was they hid it. They hid it, number 1, so the Germans couldn't confiscate it, and number 2, so the Allies couldn't bomb it again, or bomb the second one. So they kept it in pieces. And then when, of course, the war was over, they took all the pieces and put them back together again, and they had themselves almost, well, a giant aircraft. And this is the postcard and the civilian paint job they put in here. You can see it's shown with the logo of Air France, and it's quite a striking aircraft. Unfortunately, they weren't constructed very well. The motors, you can see there's 6 of them, were unsynchronized, and they vibrated, which didn't help hold the whole thing together. And what they did was they put them into service there's a special test flight to Dakar in Africa. Again, just to show you that they're featured on these labels. Next. And here's the complete set of routes that they ended up going with. You can see they did take it to England to try and sell another copy to the British, but they weren't takers in that. They did fly over to Geneva. I'll show you a cover on that one. And then the big flight was stopping here at one of the French colonies in Africa and heading over to Martinique, over on this side here. They did, towards the end of the life of the aircraft, end up making runs to Chad in darkest Africa in order to fly fish out to France from one of their large lakes there. And this route that took it over to Indochina was used to ferry military supplies over to the Indochina War in the early 50s. This is the first test flight from Dakar through to France. You can see the cachet on here. It's nice to get a registered cover because it gives you more cancellations to show you where the aircraft went. And then these are like first flight covers via the Latte. Latte is the abbreviation. It's 631. You can see they got special labels printed, and the first flight of the 631 to Martinique. Next. And here's a couple. They made a special flight to try and get some wealthy Swiss passengers down to Martinique. And you can see this is a Swiss cover. This is a Liechtenstein cover. And you can find them from France or Italy and a few other, Belgium and a few other European countries that sent covers in to get canceled. These are the cachets that you can see in two colors: Martinique back to France, Martinique back to France via Air France. And sometimes it's difficult to know that letters have been carried on the Latte 631, and a little later you can start to see that some person addressing has said via Latte 631, which is a good clue that it was actually carried on the airliner. And this is an unfortunate version. They had about 6 or 7 different aircraft that they used. This particular one was flying the route from Martinique through to the airbase on the coast of France, and it disappeared from sight and was never found again. There was a little bit of wreckage found, but that and a number of other accidents meant that Air France and the post office would not use this particular type of aircraft to move the mail or move passengers. Ended up being a freighter ferrying personnel and war equipment to Indochina near its end. The whole thing got discontinued. They put it in a big hangar at the seaplane base on the coast of France. And then a big storm came along and the roof fell in, and all the planes were then scrapped. And this is one of the best stamps that actually shows the aircraft. And it's from Chad, where the planes used to land on the big lakes there and transport fish back to the hungry people of France. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Jim. You managed to squeeze 3 in. Thank you. Our next speaker is Greg Redner. Greg is one of our newest PSSC members from 2022. You may know him as our brand spanking new RPSC president. You may know that he's an assistant professor of music at University of Western Ontario and the director of music at Metropolitan United Church in London. He has degrees from Juilliard. He impressed me in his resume when he said he studied with Aaron Copland and someone else. Aaron Copland and anyway, he's a Belgium specialist. He collects a lot about Belgium, particularly the 1920 Olympics, where we've seen one of his exhibits. He also collects the 1906 Milan World's Fair, and he's big into auxiliary markings these days. You may know he did an APS Zoom presentation on APS markings just last night. Greg also publishes regularly in Belgian Philately. So without further introduction, Dr. Greg.
Thanks very much. Let me just get myself up here.
Leonard Bernstein, that was the other one.
I figured that was the one. Yeah, that's the one everyone, he was a great guy. Okay, so I am not an Aerophilately specialist, in which case Belgium is the perfect country to study because there are very few airmail stamps, really a handful. And the ones they had served for a long period of time. But I find this issue quite fascinating for a number of reasons. Just a little bit of background. We don't think today of Belgium as a manufacturing, powerhouse. We think of it as the kind of center of the European Union in terms of its capital and that kind of thing. But in the 1840s, Belgium became the first country in Europe to have a railroad, following the example of the English. Within a reasonably short period of time, they basically took all of the great ideas that the English had and brought them to the continent. And they were a real manufacturing powerhouse at the end of the 19th century. The reason it was possible for them to do this was because during the Napoleonic takeover of the area that is now Belgium, Napoleon, of course, was very much against the church and religious properties, and he basically commandeered the abbeys and the churches, took their goods and their property, and it basically ended up, once the country was declared an independent nation, as in the hands of the government. And so there was a tremendous amount of money and real estate that was available for investment. Technologically, they've always been interested in transportation. And the kingpin of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, is Edouard Ampin, who was considered the tramway king. And the metro in Paris is based with his technology and his innovation. So all of this to say that that transportation has always been very important to the country of Belgium. I know absolutely nothing about this airplane that you see in front of you. It's the earliest example of a Belgian plane that I could find. You can see that there's a tremendous number of people standing around very excited about what's about to happen. I can imagine only that if I was the pilot of a plane that looked like that, I would probably not be nearly as excited as the crowd was. How anybody survived those things, I don't know. So Belgium issued its first series of airmails in 1930, and they feature a Fokker, F-O-K-K-E-R, monoplane, which was a very modern plane at the time. Biplanes were still, if you think about I don't know how much anyone in Canada pays attention to the American Air Force, but in the 1930s, a lot of the American Air Force were still biplanes. So this plane, the Fokker, was designed and put on these stamps to show what a modern country this was and how modern their airmail and transportation system was. And it shows the plane flying over 4 different cities. And I think it's a very handsome stamp. Those stamps serve with one overprint, served until after World War II. Obviously, they didn't serve during World War II because Belgium was occupied. But after the war was over, the Belgian government, taking advantage of the American sell-off of military property, acquired a good number of DC-4 Skymasters. The Skymaster was the transportation plane of choice at the end of the war. And what they really were looking for was a plane that could serve to fly between Brussels and Antwerp and Leopoldville in the Belgian Congo. Because that was an important route for many reasons. And the Skymaster was capable with a number of stops of doing that. It had one limitation, which was that it was not a pressurized cabin. So it could only fly at a certain height, which limited it in terms of its long-term viability. But you'll see it was published. We'll see these more a little bit clearly later on, the 6 franc, 8.5 franc, 50 franc, and 100 franc stamps. Here's the Skymaster, still US version. But these planes served they were capable of a reasonably long flight once they weren't being shot at. They were capable of a reasonably long flight with auxiliary fuel tanks in the wings. And so they were extremely comfortable inside and well appointed for travel. One of the things I found really interesting when I was researching this is the US Skymaster airmail, which came into existence also around the same time. And if you take a look, the one on the left is a reasonably rare essay for an example that wasn't used. But if you look at the one on the right, it's actually very similar to what the Belgians ended up with. And when I spoke to a friend of mine who is someone who is quite deep into this, he said that this was in fact just a fluke. It didn't happen because it was being copied on either side. So the need for the new airmail series was necessitated when Belgium raised the preferential rate that existed between the Belgian nation and the Belgian Congo. And it went from a franc 50 to 2 francs 50 per 20 grams right after the end of the war in Europe. It was the first rate change that had happened since 1935. At the same time, the general overseas postage went from 175 to 350, and that was remarkably the first rise since 1927. So the two lower values in this issue were designed specifically for the Belgian Congo. The 6 franc stamp covered the airmail rate, and the 850 stamp covered the same. In addition, covered this. 850 stamp covered the airmail rate plus registration. I don't know why it says it that way. Sorry about that. And the 2 stamps were issued on February 23rd, 1946. On February the 24th, the next day, Sabena, which is the Belgian national airline, ran an inaugural 25-hour flight between Brussels and Leopoldville in the Belgian Congo. And this is actually a remarkable trip. The plane had to land to refuel at Tangier in Morocco, Lagos in Nigeria, before it eventually arrived in Leopoldville 25 hours later. And here's a first flight cover. It's obviously philatelic, but here's a first flight cover from that flight. The Skymaster stamps were designed by Cross, who is a reasonably important Belgian stamp designer, but they were engraved by a legend of Belgian philately whose name is Jean de Bast. And he created almost 150 different stamps in his lifetime, and they're really quite beautiful. They were printed at the Stamp Works in Malines, and what makes the first generation of stamps distinguishable from the second issue is that the paper on the first issue is tinted to match the color of the ink. And so you can always tell because the second issue, as we'll see in a couple seconds, is printed on stark white paper, and so it stands out. They were perforated 11.5, and the number printed was indeterminate because it was used. The 6 and 850 franc were used well into the 1950s. They were issued in sheets of 300, divided into panes of 75. The 50 franc and 100 franc were issued 4 months after the earlier ones. So the second printing, as we have said, was made in 1954. Now this is a strange thing because in fact the stamps were prepared to be printed in 1950. So it depends on which catalog you look at, whether they were issued in 50 or 54. But the official printing date is 1950. And according to some, they weren't issued until 1954, but I have stamps that disprove that. They're identical in every way with 2 exceptions. The paper they're printed on isn't tinted, but stark white. And interestingly,
10 minutes.
Sorry?
10 minutes, please.
Yep,
Wrap
okay.
it up. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. The reason the size is different on the second issue is because they got a new printing press. And the Wifevac printing press, which came from Sweden, or the Switzerland, sorry, printed the stamps on at a different angle. And because the paper was wet, the length is increased by 1 millimeter. They're stretched. And this is very common also on other issues, like some of the later Bedouin stamps. So that's an example of them. These are very, very rare. There are not a lot of them in existence. They weren't printed in any great number and used tremendously. It's very, very difficult to find them used on cover. But I'm very lucky because I have this spectacular bordereau, which features a massive number of the 100 franc stamps, not the largest known usage, but still a massive number and a very impressive cover. And then this, which is the largest known use of the 1950 50-franc Skymaster, which is a whopping 1,750 franc bordereau. I don't know what was carried in the package. I only have the address, but it's a complete sheet of the 50 franc, and it's the largest known usage of it, and it's really quite a beautiful thing. So they served into the 1960s, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, Ken Snelson is up on deck next, and he's going to talk about the underpaid mail from the Empire airmail rate. And so Ken is our secretary of the PSSC, as we all know. He's been a member since 1991. He studied engineering at Cambridge, came to Canada in '69 to work for Ontario Hydro, and we all know him as a very strong British collector. But we also know him with this particular interest in British auxiliary and surcharge markings and postage dues. He has a book out, published in 2007, on the UK tax marks, and he had another book out in 2017 on their regional letter offices of GB. So, Ken, you're up now.
The Empire Airmail Scheme was sort of a bold experiment from June 1937 to September 1939. There's a airmail leaflet, number 45 in the Post Office Green Paper series by a man called Lumley, who was a post office official who was in charge of developing airmail. And he wrote a very interesting and thorough description of the scheme and how it was implemented and so on. And I have a copy of that. Essentially, what it was that all first-class letters and all first-class mail, that's letters and postcards, would be sent by air on Imperial Airways routes. And the surface mail on those routes would be discontinued. This is something that was very much favoured by the British government. Sorry? Very much in favour of the British government. Churchill wanted to describe it as saying it was stitching the empire together. That was the phrase he used. Anyway, they had to decide on what was the rate they were going to charge. And they set the UK for Empire Airmail, set the rate as a penny halfpenny per half ounce. The old Empire surface rate was a penny halfpenny for 1 ounce. And this allowed them to say, since 70% or more of first-class letters were less than half an ounce, they were able to advertise that most letters would be sent by air, no increase in rates, which was sort of was true, but was not completely true. Okay. Anyway, what this ended up doing is it ended up with massive amounts of underpaid mail. And what we're talking about is how that mail was treated. This is the description of the scheme. It was to be in 3 stages. Stage 1 was the route through Africa, through East Africa, down to South Africa. Stage 2, which came later in February 1938, went through the Middle East to India and Ceylon. And stage 3, in July 1938, extended that route through Malaya, Singapore, Australasia, Hong Kong. So you've got Australia and New Zealand included in that. And this is the illustration from the brochure, and it lists all the countries that were served, most empire countries. Let's deal with stage 1 to South Africa. On the left is a typical underpaid cover. It's 8th of September 1937, which is quite early in the Empire Airmail scheme. It's paid a penny halfpenny, which would have been the surface mail rate for up to an ounce. However, it was over half an ounce, so it was treated as a penny halfpenny underpaid, a penny halfpenny short, on the threepenny rate for 1 ounce. 2 times the deficiency was threepence, which was marked by a Cape Town charge mark, and threepence in postage due was charged. And very large amounts of this mail was essentially this kind of underpayment and this kind of postage due. Now, the one on the right is an example of a much heavier item, between 5 and 5.5 ounces. It's in pretty poor shape, but it's the only one I've got. It was paid 6pence halfpenny, which was the old surface rate for up to 6 ounces. So by the surface rate, it would have been fully paid, but surface rates were discontinued. So it was treated as 10pence short on the 1 shilling and 4pence halfpenny rate for 11 Empire Airmail rates. And on 8th of September in Cape Town, it was charged 2 times the deficiency, which is 1 shilling and 8pence, which was a huge amount compared to the 6pence halfpenny that would have been sufficient for surface mail. Now, I say that surface mail was discontinued. Surface mail was still allowed for printed papers and for parcels. So you could still send things by surface, but just not first-class letters and postcards. In Christmas of 1937, they were getting very, very large amounts of underpaid mail, and they decided out of the goodness of their hearts that they would waive the postage due for the Christmas period in 1937. And this is on the route to South Africa, and there were various countries along that route, like Kenya, KUT, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, with the Rhodesias, Nyasaland, Zanzibar, and so on, down to South Africa. And each administration had a label prepared, which they affixed to the underpaid items that they were not going to charge postage due on. And some of them are quite scarce. The most common ones are the British one, which isn't illustrated here, and the South African one, which is a bilingual thing in pink on the right. Okay, so that's saying that they were, out of the goodness of their hearts, waiving the postage due. The one on the left is really quite scarce. It's a Southern Rhodesian label, actually used on cover. And I have seen very, very few of those. I say that some of them are scarce. For instance, there was a cover, there was an envelope, there was a label for Zanzibar, but I've not seen it. I've only seen it illustrated in a book on Empire Airmail. So this is something worth looking out for. They had so much underpaid mail that they brought stamp cancelling machines into service to apply the tax mark. You see, at the top left, the tax mark on the bottom left is a hexagon with a T in it, and that's applied by a machine because they had so much underpaid mail to deal with. And on the back, applied by the same machine, was an instructional mark. It's illustrated there, but I've got it spelled out at the bottom. please advise sender that letters should be prepaid penny halfpenny for each half ounce. And almost all the items that have this machine tax cancellation also have this instructional mark on the back. And they have tan stamps to show the 30 centimes, which was double penny halfpenny deficiency. This one's to a kind of nice destination. It's due to it's to Swaziland, okay, which I rather like. On the right is shown another application of cancelling machines. They applied cancelling machines to the back of incoming covers, and this would be from the Empire Email countries, explaining that all letters to East and South Africa go by air at a rate of a penny halfpenny per half ounce, and half is in large letters to try and remind people of that. There were 3 of these, one for each of the stages of the Empire Airmail. This one is the scarcest because it came into use about 2 or 3 weeks before the stage 2 started. And this is particular to stage 1. And there was a different mark used during stage 2 and another different one in stage 3. So they were trying to inform people of the lower weight step, the half ounce weight step. Okay, we'll flip on to Singapore, to stage 3, and you'll notice that at the bottom it says Swaziland. Well, on the version I was going to show you, I changed that to Singapore, which is correct, and Swaziland is not correct. Okay, so this is stage 3. The scheme was extended to the Far East, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia and New Zealand, and so on. And on the left, you've got a typical kind of cover to Singapore, and it's got the machine cancelled hexagonal tax mark faintly under the boxed 30. The 30 indicates the 30 centimes underpaid, and it collected postage due stamps in Singapore to make up to pay the rate, double rate, pay twice the penny halfpenny deficiency. Now, Australia was a different kettle of fish. Most countries kind of followed the British example and used for their Empire Airmail rate their old surface rate, but we just reduced the weight step from 1 ounce to half ounce. Australia felt it couldn't do that because Australia is a very big country, and Australia had internal airmails, and the internal airmail rate was 5p per half ounce. And they didn't think it was possible for them to send airmail to England for penny halfpenny a half ounce, when airmail within Australia was being charged 5p a half ounce. So they set the rate at 5p, the Empire Airmail rate at 5p, but they kept the surface mail as being another option because of the large increase. This is an example which is paid 5p. It's over half an ounce, so it's 5p underpaid, and that gave you a tax mark of 100 centimes, which converted to 10p in the inland section in London. So the Australia was a bit different. Maybe David Frost will think about that. Canada joined the Empire Airmail on the 23rd of February 1938, but it's not mentioned in any of the British documents announcing Empire Airmail because there's no Empire Airmail to or from Britain. Empire Airmail allowed transatlantic transport by sea with air to or from London. So anything from Canada that was going via London to Empire destinations could go by Empire Airmail. The one on the left is to South Africa. It's paid 3 cents, which is 3 cents underpaid on the 6 cents Empire Airmail rate. And there's an explanatory mark at the bottom advising asking the recipient to advise the sender that the rate is now 6 cents. Now, in the other direction, it also worked. On the right-hand side, you have a letter from Palestine, which was paid at the 20 mil airmail rate, Empire rate, but it was 20 mil short on the 20 mil short on the 40 mil double rate. And in London, that was converted to threepence. They've got a threepenny FB mark. In Montreal, it was charged 6 cents postage due. On 3rd of September 1939, World War II broke out. Empire airmail was ended immediately. Many of the planes that were used were transferred to the RAF for transport duties. And that was the end of a bold experiment that was not repeated after World War II. There was no recurrence of this after when World War II ended.
Well, thanks, Ken. Lots of research, lots of in-depth research to sort that out, especially with all of the tax marks. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Haynes. David has been a PSSC member since 2003. He is an Aerophilately specialist because he likes collecting RCAF and Royal Flying Corps material. He likes collecting airmail labels and markings on Canadian mail. He's had a lot of general kinds of Canadian specialties in the past, the map stamp, the small queen, precancels, perfins, and so on. But he's going to talk to us about astrophilately, Canada and space. David, whenever you're ready.
Well, needless to say, I'm not following the same route that everyone else is doing tonight. I figured anyone that was interested would read the book, would read my article, and I have not prepared to repeat it on the air tonight. All I've done is prepared a short update of the article. On the 3rd of April, 2023, the CSA, or the Canadian Space Agency, in conjunction with NASA, North American Space Agency, made an announcement that there would be a flight scheduled to circle the moon and come back to Earth. And believe it or not, one of the personnel on that flight would be a Canadian. I have a small sketch here that would possibly show you the 4 members of this scheduled flight. The commander will be a Rick Wiseman, who's the 3rd chap over here on the right. The pilot itself would be Victor Glover, who was the 2nd fellow here. And then there'd be a mission specialist, a Christina Koch, and our Canadian, a mission specialist, Jeremy Hansen. Okay, the flight itself is scheduled to take part in November of 2024 and is scheduled for approximately 10-day flight. And this flight will show Canada to be the 2nd non-American country to actually have an astronaut leave what they call the low Earth orbit and actually travel to and around the moon and back again. A short rundown on Jeremy Hansen. Jeremy was born 27th of January 1976 in London, Ontario. He joined the Canadian military, or the RCAF, and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He joined in 1994, and he's still a current member of the RCAF. He's 47 years of age. He's married with 2 kids, and he has been a pilot for the F-18 and numerous other aircraft as well. And basically, that's it. I did not prepare to show my whole display or my whole article tonight. I was just going to update the article itself. So that's it. That's all I have tonight. It's a short and brief one.
So are there going to be philatelic souvenirs prepared?
With this one, if I'm still alive, I will be preparing them. Yes.
Is he going to carry any covers?
Pardon?
Is he going to carry any with him?
Oh, I have no idea there. I have no idea there. It was the same way with the last chap that went up, David St. Pierre. There was covers prepared by Russia, but Canada was never in the picture as to stamps, the flight, or anything else. I prepared my own covers for this situation, and I had him canceled the day he went up into orbit, up into the ISS, the International Space Station, and I had him canceled again the day he come back down to Earth. And if I'm still alive, I hope to have the one for Hansen as well made up for myself. I'm not going to say Canada's not going to do it, but Canada Post seems to be way behind in anything that's current as far as space is concerned.
Well, start working on Gene Wang. Thanks very much, David. Our last presenter for the Aerophilately section is Les Selby. Les is also one of our newest PSSC members, joining us in 2022. He's extremely active in the North Toronto Stamp Club and has been for many, many years. He's a bit of a worldwide collector, but he definitely has this passion for rigid airships and zeppelins and the mail from those aircraft. We had David on. We had Les on the CAPEX 22 organizing committee, and he worked his tail off. So his topic tonight is big airships, big business, big airships as big business. Les?
Although a number of countries developed rigid airships for military purposes, 2 countries developed them with the intent of making them commercially successful. One, of course, was Germany, and the other was Great Britain. So the whole article came out of my first exhibit I prepared on this topic. It was a 5-frame, and the judge's feedback that came back was there was so much good information for an article, but far too many words for good exhibits. So I kept that in mind, and when we were putting together the anthology, it sort of stimulated me to move forward with the article. So, and like David, I figure if you were interested, you read the article, and so I wasn't going to show you the exact same thing. I thought I would throw some different stuff in here just to be more interesting. The Zeppelin that you see on the upper left is LZ-1. Its first flight was in July 2nd of 1900. It made 2 flights, and then it was destroyed when they were bringing it out of the hangar when a high wind came by. Count Zeppelin organized several other efforts to make rigid airships, and probably the most famous was LZ-3 in the early experimental stage. It crashed into the lake, but the German public was so motivated by his efforts that a fund was set up and the public paid enough money into the fund to develop number 4. LZ-7 was known as Deutschland, and it actually was the first airship that was successfully operated by Delag. Delag was the first airline in the world, and it operated Zeppelins. And Count Zeppelin was actually against the idea of an airline, but his business manager worked out a deal with the Hamburg shipping lines. And so they started operating flights within Germany and then Northern Europe. LZ-10, the Schwaben, operated for just about a year. It made 218 flights and it carried over 1,500 passengers. The card you see there is one that was carried during the Duchess of Hesse had a week to raise funds for a home for unwed mothers. And it was a fund supported by the Duchess. And Count Zeppelin had the Schwaben there for the 8 days. It carried 400,000 special cards. And the label on the upper left, which is Cinderella, produced by the Duchy, and all the money from those went to the charity. By the time the First World War broke out, Delhi had carried over 34,000 passengers, and without an accident. Then the airships that it had were expropriated by the German military. And you would think that that would be a horrible thing for the company, but they instantly moved over to military production and produced 85 Zeppelins during World War I. So the manufacturing company did exceptionally well. The card at the upper right is just showing you, it's got a picture of a Zeppelin on the other side, and it's a visit to the Zeppelin sheds. Zeppelin made money any way he could. He had, by LZ-10, they sold stamps and envelopes on their flights and people could buy them. You could go visit the shed and buy souvenirs, and they would apply that cancellation as, say, a souvenir of your visit. And so they were ready to make money. Then after the war, the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from owning or manufacturing Zeppelins. And right after the war, the company made 2 small 30-passenger Zeppelins for Delag. They were both seized by the Allies. One went to Italy as war reparations, and the other one, I think, went to France. And they were banned from producing anymore. So the company managed to stay in business by producing cookware and other metal objects. Then Hugo Echner, who was running the company because Count Zeppelin had passed away in 1917, he convinced the Americans that they could make them another airship as war reparations because the German Zeppelin crews had destroyed a number of the craft rather than hand them over to the Allies, and a number of companies had been owed Zeppelins. So the United States government went to its allies and asked for permission for Germany to manufacture an airship. The Allies would agree only if it was a non-military airship. So LZ-126 construction began in 1923, and it was delivered to Lakehurst on October 15th, 1924, after an 81-hour flight. There at the lower right is a picture of the LZ-126, which was renamed the USS Los Angeles, and it is tethered there to the Pagoda, a naval ship that was converted to an aircraft carrier, an airship hangar. Then the Treaty of Lorenzo allowed Germany to reproduce a number of industries that had existed before the war as long as they were non-military. The problem was to build an airship costs a huge amount of money. So what the Zeppelin company did was that a number of the former Zeppelin pilots go around giving lectures and talks. They created a fund in 1925 called the Zeppelin Echner Fund, and in Germany, the Zeppelin Echner Spend. And it applied to the patriotism of the Germans to develop the industry again. So like the back of the card you see there, that these are two of the postcards that were sold at the lectures. They also sold labels that look like stamps. The back of the card, it says that, you know, this is an official postcard from the German committee for the Zeppelin Echner Spend of the German people. That was the official name. And people responded, they raised enough money to pay for more than an eighth of an airship. And the government finally broke down and also passed some money over. And the Zeppelin used its money from the manufacturing of cookware to start on the first ship. LZ-127 was begun in 1927. And to save money on infrastructure, the company designed the ship to fit inside the existing Zeppelin shed in Friedrichshafen. So it was 776 feet long with 126 feet in diameter, and it floated 18 inches above the floor and 18 inches to the ceiling. So the size of the airship was pretty much defined by the building. It had a total usable payload of 15,000 kilograms, which was a fair bit back then. And the first flight was September 18th, that should be 1928. As soon as the first flight happened, the German post office issued 2 stamps showing the Zeppelin over the globe. And Echner negotiated that Delag would receive 80% of the postage from any carried mail. So the German post office, if it sold stamps to collectors that didn't use it, was great. But for any mail that was carried, 80% of the revenue went to the airline. The first intercontinental flight for the Graf Zeppelin was to Lakehurst on October 11th. It left Friedrichshafen and arrived on the 15th. And the return flight was October 29th, November 1st. So many people were excited. The US Post Office supplied this first flight stamp. You can see the hand stamp. They applied that to every letter or postcard that went back on the Graf Zeppelin to Germany, and over 100,000 pieces of mail were carried on that flight. And then really quickly, the Zeppelin successes did European flights with paying passengers. It did the around the world flight in 1929. The cover on the upper right is an American cover mailed in Lakehurst, and that was carried on the Graf Zeppelin to Europe. The European Pan American flight, which was the 3 continent flight, and the cover at the bottom is a US 260 from US's rarest stamp for the 20th century is on that cover. The polar flight in 1931, where mail was transferred between the Graf Zeppelin and a Russian in-tourist icebreaker. And then in 1931, the Graf Zeppelin went into regular South American flight. The same time that it went into regular South American flights, components for LZ-129 began to be made. Delag was doing well enough that it ordered a second airship. And by 1937, when the Graf Zeppelin was put out to pasture, it had carried over 13,000 passengers and over 106,000 kilograms of mail and freight.
10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up fast. So here's a chart that is in the article, and it shows you the different rates and why it was so profitable. And the cover on this has a stamp in German and Portuguese to tell people that the Graf Zeppelin was going to wait for their return answer to their German mail before going back to Germany for 5 days. And then the Hindenburg, which started flights in March of 36 and did 23 flights the first season. And then, of course, everybody knows what happened on the first North American flight of 1937. Probably the most famous airplane crash that was ever recorded. LZ-130 was in production, and so it started flying, but it only did military and demonstration flights before it was deflated and hung as a tourist attraction in Friedrichshafen next to the original Graf Zeppelin. And then the Imperial Airship Scheme, Tasmania proposed that Great Britain develop a fleet of airships to connect the empire to compete with the German Zeppelin company. Vickers proposed that it would operate 6 large rigid airships to provide freight services and passenger services to the empire. But in 1924, the Labour government was elected, and so they rejected Vickers' proposal and introduced the Imperial Airship Scheme. There would be 2 airships made. One, the R100, would be constructed by the Airship Guarantee Company at Howden. It was designed by private enterprise, and so it was known as the capitalist airship. And the cover on this is one that was illegally flown on a return flight from Saint-Hubert to Cardington, where it had been kept since it was approved by the Air Ministry. Over 1 million people saw it when it was in Saint-Hubert for its 12-day visit at a time when the population of Montreal was only 800,000. So people came from all over North America to see it. And then the R101 was the other ship built by the Royal Airship Works in Cardington. Air tests showed that its lift was insufficient, so it was cut in half, and an extra gas bag with another 42 feet was entered. The flight to India began on October 4th, and along with the crew, it took a number of exceptionally important passengers, including Lord Thompson, the Air Minister. It crashed early in the morning of October the 4th in France in a rainstorm, and there were only 6 survivors, mostly people who were in the motor cars on the side. The Air Ministry ordered the R100 dismantled, and that was the end of the British Imperial Airship Scheme. The tower in Saint-Hubert stayed there until 1953, and that's when it was dismantled, and the tower is still in India standing. So I don't know if somebody was hoping they'd come back, but that is the end of that.
Well, I would like to thank all the presenters tonight. That was certainly a good sequel to your article in the anthology. I appreciate it very much and enjoyed your talks tonight for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.